In the news lately, there has been conflict between India and Pakistan, this boiling over in an area where Pakistan, India and also China share a border, which is often collectively known as Kashmir. Now, Kashmir is divided between the three countries. India controls the province of Jammu and Kashmir, while Pakistan controls the area of Gilgit-Baltistan to the north and also Azad Kashmir to the west. At the same time, China controls the sparsely populated area of Aksai Chin and the Shaksam Valley. To make matters more complicated though, India claims that from Pakistan it should have the Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir as part of the larger province of Kashmir, while at the same time the Shaksam Valley and Aksai Chin, which are now part of China, it believes should also be part of the Indian province of Kashmir. Conversely, the Pakistanis believe that the region of Jammu and Kashmir, which is today part of India, should actually be part of Pakistan. Now, I want to find out in this video, why is it all so complicated in this region? Is someone in the right? Can we even tell if someone is in the right here? And why is there so much conflict over this area in the very north of India? Kashmira is the Sanskrit name of the area of Kashmir, and obviously where the English name comes from, and although the etymology is uncertain, it probably has something to do with water. Mira is potentially lake, so related to the Indo-European word that comes out in Meer, or Meer in Dutch, which also means lake. But there's a lot of water in the area. A lot of the main rivers that flow through the Indian subcontinent do originate in the Kashmir region. And interesting enough, religion plays a very strong role in the conflict, even in modern times. But the first religions that were in this area was Hinduism, and then it became a very strong outpost of Buddhism. One of the very famous Buddhist emperors, Ashoka, he actually founded one of the capitals, Srinagar, which is still a very important city in Kashmir, as a strong Buddhist city in the area. There was a lot of syncretism mixing between Hindus, who were mostly Shaivites, so worshippers of Shiva in the area, and Buddhists. But by the 14th century, the Muslims had taken over in Kashmir. That was the Shah Mir dynasty that came to power there. But by the 16th century, the Mughals under Akbar, who I have a series of videos about, he came into the Kashmir region from his seat of power, which was in Lahore, which is Pakistan. He moved into the Kashmir region and added that to the Mughal Empire. However, when the Mughals became weaker, it became part of the Afghan Empire for a short while, but then it was taken over by another religious group, by the expanding power of the Sikhs, who started to emerge at this time. This was, of course, until 1845, when there was the Anglo-Sikh War fought with the British, and at this time the Kashmir region was taken over by the British, but very soon they'd given it to a Hindu powerful family in the area that they could rely on. And it essentially became part of, it was a princely state, so it was semi-autonomous, but essentially under the jurisdiction of someone who answered to the British. And then it became part of the wider area of British India. Now, of course, this was the state of affairs until 1947, when the Indians finally won their right to independence. But there wasn't just one country that came out of the partition of India. That's why it was a partition. There were two. And of course, if we look at the partition, the main idea was, by the British trying to broker this deal, that the two main religions in India, Islam and Hinduism, couldn't get along together, so they had to have two states for those two. Now, generally, this is the split that they had, that in the north and the west you had many more Muslims, so that was what would become Pakistan, and then also another area, which I will discuss, whereas the rest was mostly majority Hindu at the time. However, it was more complicated in Kashmir and the Punjab, which I won't mention in this one, but I'll probably make another video about, and this is where we see a lot of violence. Now, it's true that around this time of partition, there was about 75% of the population of all of Kashmir was Muslim, compared to I think about 30% of Hindus in the area. But if we break this down into the various areas in the Kashmir region, then we find different trends emerging, which is what makes this such a difficult issue. So if we look at the Kashmir Valley, 4 million inhabitants, 95% of those are Muslim, whereas 4% are Hindu. However, if we go just to the south to Jammu with 3 million inhabitants, there are only 30% Muslim and 66% Hindu. Now in another area, Ladakh, very sparsely populated, 250,000 people, there are 46% Muslim, but rather in this area, just as with Ashoka, there are 50% of the people there are Buddhist, and ethnically they are more Tibetan. So this is right on the border with Tibet, or actually with Xinjiang, which is another Chinese province. Tibet is just to the north. So ethnically these people are rather different to the ones in the Kashmir Valley and in Jammu to the south. As well, in Gilgit and Baltistan there are 1 million people, and that today is pretty much all Muslim, part of Pakistan. and also Azad Kashmir, 2.5 million people, and they are all Muslim as well, or practically all Muslim, as part of Pakistan. Given that Kashmir was a princely state, it fell to the ruler, or the Maharaja, to decide whether it wanted to join Pakistan or India. Remember, it sits slightly above India. It's the very northern point of India, so it could quite well have fit into either India or Pakistan. Now, at the time, the Maharaja was a man called Hari Singh, and he was a Hindu, but he had several things to consider before joining either side. Remember that another option was that Kashmir could just go its own way and be a completely autonomous, independent state, which would have, drawbacks and advantages all to its own. So generally speaking, the Sikhs, Hindus and Buddhists in the Kashmir area would prefer a union with India, which had promised to be a secular state, so that the religion, the majority religions, that would be Hinduism, would not interfere with the workings of the state, so as to treat people on a fairly equal basis. However, the majority in Kashmir obviously was Muslim, and they would prefer a movement into Pakistan, which was, explicitly a Muslim nation for Muslims. However, many of the people were worried that because Hari Singh was a Hindu, that he would choose to align with India. And for this region, also aided by Pakistani tribesmen, Pashtuns, who were of the same ethnicity as many of the Muslims in the Kashmir area, rebelled against Hari Singh and started to push his forces back so as to forcibly add Kashmir into Pakistan. However, at this point, Hari Singh turned to help to the Indian government, and he signed the Instrument of Accession. Essentially, it said that Indian forces would come in and help Hari Singh to defeat the rebels and the Pashtuns from the area of Pakistan, obviously in return for him saying that Kashmir would then go over to India. So, if we look at the legislation then, him as the Maharaja, he would make the final choice of whether it went to India and Pakistan. And his signing of the Instrument of Accession basically said that he thought that the entire area should go to India, and he as the ruler had the right to say that. Now, of course, I'm not going to pick a side in this debate because there are many sides to it, but this is essentially the main Indian claim as to why Kashmir and all of it should belong to India, is because the Instrument of Accession, which was signed by the then ruler of all of Kashmir, that it would go into Indian hands. Now, this was also done under the promise that there would, after the conflict, after the Pashtun rebels had been kicked out of Kashmir, that then there would be a vote in the area for the people whether they would then join Pakistan or India. However, the idea of having an independent Kashmir, that was taken off the table. That wouldn't be part of the vote. However, to this day, this vote has never taken place, which is partially what underpins the Pakistani claim that the people have never been asked of Kashmir whether they want to be in Pakistan or in India, so that therefore it's unlawful that Kashmir is divided the way it is. Now, at this time, when the Indian army did come in, they managed to push out the tribesmen that had attacked, but then Pakistan, seeing that there hadn't been any movement on the voting front, saw this as a direct offence, and they then sent troops into the region as well. So in 1947, you have the first war between India and Pakistan. They really didn't hang around for very long, and they were already at each other's throats during this time. However, the war really was bogged down. No side gained a massive advantage, and the UN got involved, and they stopped the war from spreading any further. And at this point, we get two various regions of the Kashmir area with the two sides. Essentially, what the two troops could keep a hold of became the border. So to the south, you had Indian-administered Kashmir, and then in the north and the west, you had Pakistani-administered Kashmir. The next move came neither from the Pakistani nor the Indian side, but a third player entered the game. In 1962, the Chinese invaded the area of Aksai Chin, and after a quick skirmish known as the Sino-Indian War, they won a victory over the Indian army and claimed this piece of land. It seems a bit odd because it's all incredibly high and hardly anyone lives in that area, but it was all part of a strategic maneuver for the Chinese to essentially build this huge road, and then that went through Tibet as well, which is just to the north. It also then links Tibet, which is to the north there, China, with the more southerly Xinjiang province as well. Now, China also played into Pakistan, although they didn't actually have to invade the area of Pakistan. They made some threats, essentially by just drawing a map, which says a lot about China's power in the region. The Pakistani authorities became worried, but after a treaty between the two, they handed over control of the Shaksam Valley area to the Chinese as well, which then became part of the Chinese-administered region of Tibet. Inspired by how easily the Indian army had been defeated by the Chinese, the Pakistanis 3 years later in 1965 aided insurgents and crossed over the border in a full-scale invasion. However, they were generally fought to a standstill by Indian infantry and armoured troops, and by the end of the war, which was a ceasefire, the Indians definitely had the upper hand, controlling more land that had been Pakistan's, as opposed to Pakistani troops controlling Indian land, and the borders essentially went to what they had been before, with India feeling a bit better about itself. Now, this also led to the fact that both countries had relied on Great Britain to aid it, because obviously Great Britain had been the essentially the father country of both. But when they didn't, they turned their attention to the communist powers. Of course, 1965 was the height of the Cold War, and they turned more towards the Soviet Union and to China, which were both powers in the region, for support, essentially brokering the other side, because the Allies hadn't really helped them that much during this war, which would then play a bigger part in the conflict. Now, the next time they went to war is actually because of another reason of the partition. Now, if you remember, the partition was largely down to religious grounds, although it was done incredibly sloppily by the British, which led to tens of millions being displaced and lots of people dying as well. Now, the main region of Muslim areas in the Indian subcontinent had been the northwest, and this was obviously Pakistan. However, there was also another region that was majority Muslim. So the division was thus that you had West Pakistan, which is now Pakistan, India, but also East Pakistan in the Bengal region. Now, East Pakistan was also largely Muslim, which is why they decided, well, they must be able to get along with West Pakistan. But if you look at it on a map, it's really quite stupid, all the hostile territory of India between the two. And actually, culturally, they were really quite different. So if we look at what they both wanted, the various ethnic groups in the region, you had Pashtuns, you had Sindhis, Punjabis, Mujahirs, which are actually, they're actually Muslims who came from areas within what's today India, and they make about 5% of the population, and they moved into Pakistan, so they were completely displaced people, as well as the Baloch and the Kashmiris. However, in this area of East Pakistan, you mainly had Bengalis. Also, if you look at the languages that were spoken, Punjabi today makes it 45% of what's spoken. Pashto, so spoken by the Pashtuns, is spoken by 15%, Sindhi by 12%, Saraiki by 10%, and Urdu by 5%. Urdu is actually, don't tell the Indians and Pakistanis, but it's basically the same language as Hindi, it's just written in the Arabic script. So this is the language spoken by people who came in from India, as well as Balochi, which is spoken by 3.6%, whereas Bangla or Bengali is spoken by pretty much everyone in East Pakistan, or as it's known today, Bangladesh. And there were also other divisions between the two. So West Pakistan wanted to make East Pakistan to use the Urdu language, which pretty much no one used in this area. They were all speaking Bengali. At the same time, they wanted them to use the Urdu script, so the Arabic script to write in rather than the Bengali script. They also wanted them to be more devoutly Muslim. Of course, they were Muslim, but the Islam that they worshipped there had been integrated with Hindu tradition as well, so it was different to what was being worshipped in West Pakistan. And they also wanted to retain a monopoly. So while the area of West Pakistan looks absolutely huge, it actually had fewer people than East Pakistan. And this created a difficulty because they wanted to retain the power, whereas, of course, by proportional representation, and this happened in 1971, that in East Pakistan they had all voted for the same guy, and he would essentially rule the entire country that way because he had the most votes. But West Pakistan vetoed it, and this essentially set off a string of events. Now, as well, East Pakistan, although they had become part of this broader country of Pakistan on just religious issues, culturally was really quite different. So they really appreciated the Bengali culture, so the Bengali language and tradition and ways of worship. So they wanted more cultural freedom. They also wanted proportional representation because obviously they had more people, so it makes sense for them to have to want to be more autonomous and to be able to, if they had voted for someone, to have that person actually go into the position that they had been voted into. As well as more secularism, they wanted essentially to be able to worship and not be told by other people how to do it. So these are all values that really were more Indian than Pakistani, or that were being pursued more by the Indian government, and this led to difficulties between the two, and eventually led to the Bangladeshi War of Liberation, which India got involved in, and then we get the separation of West Pakistan, which is known today as Bangladesh, separating from West Pakistan, which is now just Pakistan. Although this conflict didn't really spill over into the Kashmir area, this was more between India and Pakistan in Bangladesh. The next real great issue was the 1986 election, which was very widely believed to have been rigged by the Indian government, which is when you get a very, very pro-Indian cabinet being selected by Kashmiris who had been polled, and it was very clear were not that pro-Indian and definitely wasn't reflected in the election results that came forth. And after this, you had a lot of violence on the street. 1986 is also the year in which you get an incredibly large amount of militant groups being founded, possibly tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people joining armed insurgent groups against the Indian government in the Indian-held area of Kashmir and Jammu.
In the spring of 1991, the Pakistani government allowed its troops to disguise themselves dressed as Kashmiri insurgents and to cross the border into the Kargil Valley region, which is in the north of Ladakh in Kashmir, although they were then found by the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force, and another war broke out, which is often called the Kargil War, or known to India as Operation Vijay, which is, I believe, the Hindi word for victory. However, during this war, once again, the Pakistani troops were pushed back by the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force, and they were pushed to a stalemate, which was then agreed in July, ending this conflict as well. So at the end of it all, this is what the area of Kashmir looks like today, with the Pakistani-administered area of Kashmir in the north and the west, with the Indian-administered Kashmir in the largest part of the south, and then the Chinese-administered regions that are largely uninhabited, connecting to China there. So it really is a divided part of the world at the moment. But if we look at a few more demographics, we can see perhaps why each state has done the actions that it's done. So India controls 43% of the territory, with Pakistan close behind with 37% of the territory, and China owning roughly the remaining 20%. However, if we look at population, it's true that the Jammu and Kashmir area has 70% of the population, as opposed to the territory, that most of them live in the very fertile Kashmir Valley region, which might be why Pakistan keeps trying to come over the border in the instances in 1991 and in the 1960s as well. What's also important to remember is that I've basically been talking about two different countries, India and Pakistan, and sometimes China, using their militaries to get political gain and take over. But one of the huge problems with the Kashmir conflict is that a large part of the fighting is done by the Kashmiris themselves, who have various insurgent groups. So these are, depending on how you stand, terrorist groups or freedom fighters. They're probably a bit of both, which have been linked to Islamic fundamentalist groups. Al-Qaeda's got involved in the area as well. And these, some of the most famous ones are Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed and Harkat al-Mujahideen are the main groups in the area that fight against the Indian government. And these are generally pro-Pakistan groups, so they want to oust the Indian government and have Pakistani control. A lot of this, however, is also spawned by the fact that there are a lot of human rights abuses going on in Kashmir, often perpetrated by the Indian Army and the Indian police, who aren't held to scrutiny, which helps them to recruit, as well as other factors that go into it. It's quite complicated. But these are certainly forces to be reckoned with. In 2008, the Mumbai bombings were carried out by people from Lashkar-e-Taiba, who have their links to Al-Qaeda as well, which makes them especially dangerous, that it draws into a kind of more global Islamic extremism that's going on, that's then channeled through the Kashmir region. Of course, it has links with Afghanistan as well, just to the north. So it's a very volatile position in the area at the moment. There is, of course, another group, the Kashmir and Jammu Liberation Front, which actually calls for Kashmir and Jammu to become an independent country. And I think in the 1980s and 1990s this was a very popular movement, and they did get some support from the Pakistani government, but they do actually think that Pakistan needs to leave the Kashmir region as well. So they would like a Kashmir that's run by the Kashmiris themselves, not by Pakistan, not by India, but by themselves. And this has gained traction in certain areas. So that's sort of the third alternative that was laid out right at the start in 1947 that some people are still pushing for. But of course, they still haven't had that referendum. And of course, one more reason for all the conflict in the area of Kashmir is that many of the largest rivers that flow through the Indian subcontinent start in Kashmir. So of course, the very famous Indus rivers, they come from up there. It's in the top of the Himalayas. A lot of it's very high altitude. And these rivers, they all flow down. And this is one of the reasons they did actually sign an agreement, India and Pakistan, that the three Western rivers would go to Pakistan, that they would have access to those sources, and the 3 eastern ones would go to India. But if one country could control the majority of the water supply of the other, then they could seriously damage their agriculture and potentially gain, serious advantage in a war, which is one of the reasons why they're probably fighting over this region so much, because of this access to water. There are 700,000 as of currently, 700,000 Indian soldiers in the Kashmir region. There are 506,000 displaced people. Many of the displaced have actually already moved on and gone into other areas. But what's quite telling is that half of these are actually Kashmiri Hindus. So although they made up only a smaller part of the demographics, half of the 506,000 are actually Hindus who have been forced to flee from their homes in the various parts. Some of them in the border region, so in the Indian administered Kashmir, and others from Pakistani administered Kashmir. But basically, it's quite a big mess over there at the moment. And really, the saddest thing is that obviously India and Pakistan are using Kashmir to fight their own political battles. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of the time the Kashmiri people who are the ones who get the airstrikes against them, who have essentially foreign soldiers occupying their soil. And I think this drives a lot of Kashmiris either to join sort of the Kashmiri Liberation Front or the other groups that are more pro-Pakistan because of these abuses, rather than because of necessarily a real political drive one way or the other. But yeah, essentially this is my take on what's going on in Kashmir. I have oversimplified some parts a little, just so that the video didn't end up being half an hour long, although it probably will be about half an hour long, knowing me. But I hope you have indeed enjoyed it. So I've tried to be as unbiased as possible, to look at various different sources and to see things from... I'm hesitant to say both sides, because I feel like there's quite a few sides that you could take in this whole debate between the two, but each side has their own kind of reasoning for why they believe that Kashmir should belong to them, or why the Kashmiris believe that it's rightfully theirs, and that they should be allowed to vote on the future, which is certainly something. But it's so heavily militarized and politicized at the moment that we're not really sure what the future is going to bring. But hopefully there'll be a de-escalation, and then more political talks is probably always a favoured alternative to having potential of war between two nuclearly armed states, which would be great. But anyway, huge thanks to the patrons who have just come up, and I will see you all very soon. So thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. This has been History with Hilbert about the Kashmir conflict. Why are India and Pakistan fighting about Kashmir?